This is the third in a series of conversations of with British policing at an inflection point as the subject area, and stresses and tensions and what to do about them is the theme for the day. We have a panel of people who've done sterling service for us before in all but sort of one case, and I'm very delighted to introduce them. When Nick Herbert was the sort of policing minister, he did 3 big speeches for us, which came to be described not by him or me, but it was by a friendly outsider as the Cityforum Herbert Gethysburg addresses, which looked at sort of policing as he envisaged it as the opposition came into to form the coalition government after 2010, and we were extremely grateful to him for his support of 3 successive events for us, which were of very considerable interest and very well received. I think we're delighted you can be with us again in your sort of capacity guiding the College of Policing. Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime in sort of London, she has contributed sort of before to our forums, and we're extremely grateful to have you again, Sophie. We've been delighted to talk about this project with several of your colleagues who've also been known to us over the years. Hacer Evans returns to our platform. We're delighted to say we missed her when she departed from policing. We didn't get round to her in time when she was doing health, and we're delighted that now that she's at Accenture, that she's sort of coming into today's sort of forum, because we've always valued the thinking that you provided for us, Hacer. So another returnee whom we're delighted to see. Olivia Dixon, as a younger sort of police figure, has produced several extremely interesting sort of comments for us from a different generation of people in the police. It's impressive that, in my view, that the police can secure and attract folk like Olivia. We look forward very much to what you have to say this afternoon. Then QED from Bradford is coming into the conversation. Mohammed Ali, the head of that organisation with which we work sort of quite frequently, he's been unfit and will be sort of commenting quietly from the background. And Taslim Rashid, who is a central figure in his organisation, will be speaking as well. Very pleased to have you with us, Taslim, and I'd like to share some of your fruit, please, if you can pass some across. Una Jennings has had to withdraw at the last moment, and Giles and I have gone around the group of attendees to sort of chivvy up people, if there are any needed, who could contribute to the discussion when it sort of happens sort of later. But this is a forum which hasn't been short of comment and short of discussion. The first part of it, the short panel contributions on the record. The second part of it, sort of off the record and absolutely under the Chatham House rule, if you be so kind. These projects are developable only with the kindly help of some business organisations, and I'm most grateful to BT Cisco for their support for our policing work again. Motorola and Accenture have both come in to sort of help us as well, and Hacer will be speaking for Accenture, and we also have help from Tech UK. The series has gone well so far. Together with one or two colleagues, I shall try to produce a report afterwards. We deliberately run these sessions on a quite brief basis of an hour of introductions followed by an hour of discussion, because I'm frequently sort of asked, what did your group actually decide, and what can you report which is a consensus or a semi-consensus, or can you report where there is sort of absolute disagreement? But can you offer some guidance with clarity? We find that those events that last 2 or 3 and 4 days, where people drift in and out, it becomes extremely difficult to do other than invent conclusions. And we've tried to keep these short in order to make possible the development of certain conclusions. We're delighted to be chaired today by Giles York, ex-chief constable in Sussex, old friend of Cityforum. I think one of the best forum chairmen we could have. Delighted to have you with us, Giles, and look forward to your conducting another excellent discussion. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you for your really kind words, and also great introduction to this panel. I'm very lucky because I've worked with all of this panel pretty much before, and I think they bring great depth and breadth. It really is a paradua ad astra of people amongst the panelists who are with us this afternoon. And I know that there's something about getting the most out of these opportunities. It's not only about coming out and giving forth, but it's also the ability to learn. So the chance for somebody in the stratospheric position of Lord Herbert to be able to listen firsthand to the boots on the ground Olivia Dixon is just extraordinary. And so it really is that opportunity to listen, but for each of the panelists as well, it's a chance to influence. And so it's across that piece, from the private sector, the front end, the governance that Sophie brings to bear into this as well, is incredibly relevant. And I'm really pleased because this is the third in a series of 4 seminars that Cityforum is running on the kind of the not undifficult question of the relevance of the Pelian principles in application today. But if you were only going to tune into one, this is the one to have tuned into. And why is that? Because this is the tricky one. This is the edgy one, because today is when we're concentrating on the stresses, the tension, the inflection point, the irritating things that make you stamp when you come back into the office, that make you grit your teeth and be polite to the people who are around here. But of course, stress, tension, and inflection isn't necessarily a negative. They are drivers for their change. They're the things that come out that really make us want to make something different. And that's why I'm really excited about the breadth and the depth of the panelists that are here today, and really excited to be able to choose to chair this session, which is around those tension points, and really hope it elicits a reaction from the people listening to fill that chat room with the questions, put it in the chat. If you wanted to go directly to one of the panelists, name them in there and I'll be able to put those questions to them. But let's really try and bring out those points of tension, those points of frustration. It's not quite the psychiatrist's couch this afternoon for you, just a vent, but actually in a constructive way, really be able to listen, really be able to influence and focus on the things that we think need to be able to change through all of this. And I'm really pleased, first off, to be able to invite Sophie Linden to open the afternoon for us. Sophie, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Giles. And almost feel like you've invited me to have a bit of a therapy session, but I'm not going to, not going to really. No, thanks so much for inviting me to join today. It's really important. And, it's always the case, isn't it, at the start of the new year that you think about, well, you think again about what you're doing. I always come back from Christmas thinking, refreshed and, thinking about that. But actually, we've been doing that for a while, as have all police and crime commissioners across the country. And my role is basically the police and crime commissioner for London, although Sadiq is it and he delegates it all down. Sadiq Khan is the police and crime commissioner, he delegates it all to me. And police and crime commissioners across the country have been doing that because we've all been having to develop and publish and consult on our police and crime plans, and that really is about thinking about, well, what is it that we're struggling with, what is it we really want to achieve, and and as with all police and crime commissioners, for me in London and the view from MOPAC, we've been assessing the evidence as to what the evidence base as to what is happening in London and what are the key issues. And as I'm sure everybody knows, in this virtual room, the Police and Crime Plan will set out the key priorities for the police and other partner agencies over the next 3 years, actually, for this particular type of Police and Crime Plan, because of the pandemic delaying the publication and delaying Police and Crime Commissioner elections. And looking back, I genuinely, in 2017, when we published the final Police and Crime Plan for the period of, the period that we've just gone through, I don't think we would have ever thought that the next Police and Crime Plan would be being prepared in the context and the circumstances in which we are preparing this Police and Crime Plan. But even so, many of the issues that we're facing and we're grappling with they're not actually necessarily new. They've been thrown into sharper focus, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, have become much, much more intense. For example, the deep-rooted concerns around serious youth violence, the vital importance of the public having trust and confidence in the police, and ensuring that the police have the resources that they need to keep Londoners safe, and that they have the ability and they are effective in keeping Londoners safe. So what's become clear is that the current environment for me has exacerbated, intensified so many of the issues that our city has been dealing with for a long time, and actually also probably is not. I know it's not just London that is dealing with these problems. And the pandemic's really touched on all our lives in the ways that we couldn't possibly imagine just 2 years ago. So, and it's not just down to the pandemic. I'm not putting this all down to the pandemic, but take the issue of serious violence. It's true, it's absolutely true to say we mustn't lose sight of that the number of key indicators of violent crime have actually been going down in London, and that includes knife crime for victims under 25, knife crime more generally, and gun crime. Those are indicators that have gone down. But I know it won't have escaped anybody's attention here that we have reached the grim and awful record of teenage murders in London. 30 teenagers lost their lives in London last year. I mean, that's just shocking, and the Mayor and I absolutely refuse to accept that the loss of those young lives is inevitable. And we will continue to be relentless in taking the bold action needed to put an end to violence in our city, and in particular, how do we protect teenagers in London? And if we take the issue of violence against women and girls, it's clear that we are living in and operating in unprecedented times again. And I know that the horrific murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer and the failings in the cases of the devastating murders of Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman will have deeply impacted everyone in this virtual room, but it's had an impact beyond London, really impacted London, but an impact far beyond that than London, as will have the experiences of the countless other women and girls who don't hit the headlines, but who are dealing with violence, fear and intimidation in their day-to-day lives, nearly predominantly at the hands of men. And this is made only worse by the structural and ingrained misogynistic attitudes that are deep-rooted in our society and enable more violent behaviours to flourish. So this context creates new and unique challenges for overseeing the police, overseeing the professional standards of police, and overseeing the effectiveness and efficiency of the police. And those are really integral in my role as Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime in London. And of course, the past 2 years have also been defined by the worldwide condemnation of the racial injustices that are all too prevalent in our society. The tragic murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, the Black Lives Matter protests, and a number of high-profile incidents within London put the very culture of policing in the spotlight, and huge questions were rightly asked about the lack of trust and confidence that members of London's diverse communities have in their police. So we are continuing to deliver on that, and in response to those concerns, we launched the Mayor's Action Plan for transparency, trust and accountability in policing. It was developed with the community and the police together, and work is continuing apace to implement the plan to help to ensure that our communities feel that they are properly listened to and the concerns about disproportionality are acted upon. And we know that the level of trust and confidence that Black Londoners have in the police is a significant problem, but sadly they're not the only ones where this is an issue. A precious bond of trust between women and the police has also been damaged by the incidents and the events of last year. Now, these concerns are not new, but it's undeniable that there is a new added urgency to deal with them, and the risks involved are greater than ever. There's always also been a unique responsibility that comes with policing our capital city. So, London is a truly global and international city, and it's also the home of government and the home of our democracy. I'm incredibly proud of London for that. But it's also drawn a number of protesters to our streets, and given the important role that protests play in a healthy democracy, that of course is right and proper and is, to be welcomed. but it does place a burden of responsibility upon the Metropolitan Police and that burden has been increasing, and it also creates tension as well. And how do you police the significant number of protests in the capital and the significant number of very different stances that are taken on a daily basis within the capital? When I get briefed as to what's happening at the weekend, I'm always, not amazed, but I'm always the number of different groups that come out to protest in London and quite rightly exercise their right to protest is quite incredible. It's part of the diversity and the vibrancy of our democracy. So these are really not usual times. And as I said, the pandemic, I think, brought a lot of this into really sharp and more intense focus. And it has also brought its own unique challenges. How have the police stepped in? How they have policed COVID. Really, these are issues that, whilst are very unique to the pandemic, will have an impact far beyond the pandemic as well. So it's really important that Cityforum's thinking about today about this moment of reflection, and it's through that we are building our police and crime plan, and how we're looking forward and how we're turning to the future, and how we think about how do we keep our city safe, our residents safe, our community safe, the commuters and tourists safe, but also how do we oversee the professional standards of the police and as I talked about, the efficiency and effectiveness of the police. And at the heart of that is a question that needs to be answered, which is what type of city do we actually want to be living in? And, what type of city does London want to be? And how does police respond, become the trusted service it absolutely is committed to becoming? And I think recovery from COVID-19, when we're through it eventually, and as we build this recovery, it really gives us an opportunity. And this is what we're thinking about in London as part of the mayoralty. And I think that's one of the unique opportunities of being in a mayoralty, is that it gives an opportunity to build back our city safer, fairer, and more prosperous, and more equal as well. We've got the chance to address the structural and deep-rooted issues such as poverty, social integration, racial injustice, which have proven to be key causes of crime. But in doing so, we've really, as well, and not losing sight of the key issues for a police and crime commissioner of holding the police to account and maintaining high levels of police performance and effectiveness, ensuring that the nuts and bolts of the service that the public receive from their police. For example, we've really got to increase and improve the number of detections, prosecutions, as well as ensuring there's a good service response. Those nuts and bolts of policing have to be focused on and improved, and they are all incredibly important. And they feed into trust and confidence. These aren't separate issues that have no links. And I don't need to tell anyone on this call that detection rates are just far too low, and they've got to improve. Some of them are, some of them, as the Commissioner and the leadership of the Met have accepted, are just woeful, and that is across the country, not just a London issue. So within the consultation for the police and crime plan in London, there is a clear expectation that detection rates for a number of crime types must increase, and we outline how we will monitor and hold the Met to account for delivering that. We're also working to address the appalling court backlog. That's a real issue. This is another tension, another problem for us. It was already, again, exacerbated, already unacceptably high before the pandemic, but has now reached crisis levels in London. I think we are pretty, there's only a few other areas of the country where it is as intense as it is in London at the moment, and it is effectively denying justice for many. And so too, we are working to tackle the low rates of convictions for rape cases, and that links into court backlogs, but very much is about policing and investigation. And we are really pushing for improvements in the police response to rape and sexual offences. It's why we were part of and we led the development of Operation Soteria Bluestone, which has examined police investigation of rape in Avon and Somerset and the Met, and is moving on to 5 other forces. Incredibly important piece of work. And helping victims through the court process will improve conviction rates. And I'm really proud that London's leading in this area. It's also, again, integral to improving that trust and confidence in the police. That's a real focus for us. And then, as with any discussion about policing and crime, we've got to remember, and we've always got to be flexible about the changing nature of crime, whether that be online or in the real world, if you want to call it. And we've got to remain flexible so that we can not only deal with the crime and the antisocial behaviour that we are tackling at the moment, but actually we've got that ability to learn to try to keep ahead, and policing can tackle the new threats and the new risks and the new vulnerabilities that are coming through.
That's fabulous, Sophie.
Sorry?
Are you nearly done? Is that?
Yes, I am nearly done, don't worry, I am.
Well, thank you.
I am. It's just the only other thing I wanted to say was that that's why it's really vital in terms of the recovery from the pandemic that we keep our communities together. That one of the tensions we also need to think about is actually what does the future hold in terms of social integration, community tensions, and that we have to be tackling the exclusion, isolation and alienation that are drivers of all kinds of crime and really are drivers of victimisation as well as offending. So I'll leave it there, Giles. Thank you.
Sophie, that's a fantastic base for us to be able to start from, because you've addressed what we were 4 or 5 years ago, what it is that we're facing today, all of the challenges that face with that, and some of the really critical issues that are highlighted by many of the high-profile issues that affect you in London, but are equally relevant right the way across the country. Before we just move on to be able to hear from Hacer Evans around that, who will have a particular insight as well, being one of your residents, being subject to an awful lot of kind of some of the groups that you've talked about there in our communities, but equally having moved from policing to health and now into Accenture, has a fabulous view across all of them and a perspective probably that's changed a bit as well. But can I press upon you listening in as well to start using the chat function to put questions to the panel so that we've got something to go with once the panelists have stopped talking, stopped doing their initial presentations. Without more ado, Hacer, lovely to see you.
Thank you, Giles. It's great to be back and great to see so many familiar faces and names within the audience. I have been asked to talk to you today about how the public and private sector can work together to improve the victim journey. And what I'd like to add to this mission I've been given is the word today. So if you'd asked me, as Giles has described, if you'd asked me 2 years ago when I was still in policing, I would have had a very, very different perspective. But that perspective has developed over time, and I hope to share some of that with you today. As Sophie has described, we have all lived through the last 2 years where we have witnessed and been part of a shift due to the pandemic. And trust me, of all people, to have joined the NHS 2 weeks before a pandemic hit, and suddenly found myself in a sector I knew nothing about, and at this very desk, not knowing anyone in my team or not having met many people within the organisation. But my overall observation would be that citizen expectation has reset, and that is to a much more personalised and instant experience as the norm. And personal choice has never been so amplified, and emotions have never been so heightened. And this all leads to increased social tensions in society as a whole, and not only from a policing perspective, but also from a health perspective as well. Layer this with political questions and pressures. Why something was done or why something wasn't done, questions about behaviours and leadership styles have all come into question over the last 24 months. And this was absolutely some of my experience at my time at the NHS. Speed and expectation went off the scale within days. Things became highly politicised very, very quickly. Suddenly we had the Secretary of State for Health in the room when we were making delivery decisions. And that was a very, very different position to the way in which NHS Digital, NHS England and X had worked previously. However, what we had to do was consider our approach to this. How were we going to deal with that? And what we did was consider how we could harness and leverage that political involvement to help pave the way. So we often hear the phrases such as cutting through red tape. Giles, your phrase that sticks with me, which is the Data Protection Act should be the Data Sharing Act. And what we did was use political involvement to help unblock some of these things over a very, very short period of time. And suddenly the autonomous and very distributed NHS had to come together to make things work. Now, whether that was to understand recovery and restoration of service in terms of those that were in backlogs for cancer screening and many other standard operations and business as usual across health, or whether it was about delivering new technologies such as test and trace, vaccination programme, or things like risk stratification for shielded patient lists. All of this needed speed. And what we were able to do is work with our politicians and our Secretary for Health to actually start making changes and bring about regulatory changes that would allow us to move forward at pace. So the introduction of COPI notices to allow data to be shared in a much more collaborative way for the uses of COVID was a massive game changer for us, because it meant that we could move data across organisational boundaries without the challenges that I know policing faces every day. Now, what helped with all of this was the immense and strong foundation that the NHS is built on. And we had a crisis, so something had to be done. But if I look at that through the lens of policing, policing is built on the same strong foundation. And I don't know anywhere or anybody who can deal with a crisis better than policing can. And so therefore, I think it's a real opportunity, and there are some real transferable approaches that can be moved from my health experience into the policing experience. But I think the first step is actually identifying the catalyst that is going to actually initiate the change. And that is a challenge in itself. What is the thing that is going to make the fundamental difference that is going to allow this to move forward in a very, very different way? So finding that catalyst is my first challenge to policing, really. For some time now within health, the patient, the participant or member of the public has been placed at the centre for everything that we do. And the greatest success has come from truly understanding what that individual wants. And policing has been trying to understand for as long as I've been in policing, so over the 25 years I spent there. And we've done that through engagement and consultation. And again, my second challenge would be, we need to take this a step further. So we have dabbled in policing with user-centric design. I think what we need to do is take that step further into human-centred design. And this is a really unique process and chance to design with our communities. It's successful on the deep understanding of the folks that we serve, whether that be in health or whether it be in policing. And it is rooted in people's needs, motivations and concerns. Human-centred design also introduces a lens of social benefit, whether that be accessibility or social mobility as examples. But it does require that catalyst and some other behaviours that drive this in the right direction. And that first behaviour is one of empathy. And I don't mean empathy in the way in which policing has used empathy in the past, but I mean truly immersing ourselves in the understanding of what the community wants. The second is around problem solving, and that would be more around creativity and approaching problems in very, very different ways. And I think the final but most important is consistency. It takes time and it takes consistent approaches to build that trust. Now, the new world is looking at every interaction or process from a victim or public point of view, accepting that one size no longer fits all and having the ability to really tailor the response to the nature of the incident, person or the interaction itself. And this is going to continue to change and evolve over time. So it will need to be continually iterated. It needs to become part of our DNA in the way in which we operate. And it's got to be based on outcome or change impact, rather than whether we finished something or not, which is our traditional approach in terms of delivery, campaigns, initiatives within the policing environment. So it's a continuum rather than it's happening now, we'll finish and we'll move on. I'd say alongside this, technology has really found its place in the world over the last 2 years. It's at the heart of everything we do in all dimensions of life. And so therefore, looking at the specific power of things like analytics through this lens that are going to drive better insight, whether that be through social media, demand or investigative insights. And I really do think that, going back to my data point, looking out for how data is going to be used for the good going forward. So using it to drive a behaviour from a public perspective, And that's absolutely happening within the NHS, where lifestyle choices, information around the individual is driving targeted interventions around a particular individual that might be a smoker into targeted lung screening, as an example. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The NHS is trying to position the responsibility in the hands of the member of the public to actually engage as well. And there is a process by which to drive that behaviour in the right direction over time. And I'd say from an Accenture perspective, organisations like us are looking at how we partner more widely with third sector organisations, and they bring a different perspective, expertise and insight. And you combine that with some of our technology and our solutions, our interactive capabilities, and it really does start providing victim-centric solutions that are really, really interesting and very, very different. I think the value of this combination of coming together of a number of organisations across public, private and third sector, you just cannot underestimate the power that brings. And I've witnessed the differential that brings in a different sector during a crisis, and it has really made things move at pace. And what I have from my time at the NHS and Accenture is that incremental change is no longer hitting the mark. And it requires speed and pace. So rather than continuing in doing the things the way we always have, we almost need to leapfrog forward. And again, what I've learned from my NHS experience is a sector cannot do that on its own. It means the public and private sector working together in a true strategic partnership, not about a fence and one being one side and one being the other. It's something that's built on trust, shared outcomes, and in this, proximity is everything. And that's both from a service perspective in terms of the public, the victim or the patient in terms of the NHS, and also the proximity of the private sector with the public sector, and bringing those two things much, much closer together. And it's the strength of that relationship that really, really drives success. I believe it gives a richer understanding, it gives targeted solutions, and it gives improved outcomes for the victim and an overall improved victim journey. Thank you, Giles.
Hacer, thank you. And what you do draw together there is the complexity of consistency and change, both of which people love, and technology and human, both of which people love. But they're not always the best partners to be able to rub one against the other. And so we'll see what the audience has perspectives around that. But Hacer, that's a great kind of follow-on there from the perspective that you have from, I don't think it's unique, but nearing unique, of having moved out of policing into NHS and now across to the profit-making private sector element of our work. But thank you so much for that input. Which takes us on to Olivia. And Olivia, it's great to see you here again and being able to share your thoughts with us. And I think it is particularly about kind of drawing out the tensions and the points of inflection and that kind of face-to-face bit with community that you're facing on a day-to-day basis is going to be fascinating to hear from you. Olivia, thank you very much.
Hiya. Yeah, I've attended a number of these events now. Last spoke, I think, in October 2020 for the Workforce series. I wasn't too sure quite how my sort of input was going to fit with this topic, but after chatting with Mark and sort of more talking about the Pelion principles, I kind of thought, actually, being a serving police officer, I actually can't remember the last time I looked at them and I thought about them and I thought what they meant. So I read through them. I thought maybe they don't quite fit with modern day policing, but then I thought, is it that the principles aren't appropriate anymore, considering they're set out back in 1829, or is it that the stresses and tensions between the police and the public are at such a point where it feels like we're actually failing to achieve them? As mentioned earlier, the last 2 years have really brought policing, both nationally and internationally, to the forefront of the media and public speculation. Again, mentioned earlier, several high-profile cases ranging from the murders of George Floyd and Sarah Everard. It's raised important issues, including racism, use of force, misogyny, abuse of powers, and particularly male violence. Some might say that modern life has empowered people to share their opinions and experiences. Unfortunately, there are more cynical who might say it's stirred up an sort of extreme hatred of the police. But the key themes that I sort of felt running through the Peeling principles are that the police are the public and that we police with their consent. Yet I would argue in the last 2 years, being a police officer couldn't feel more distant from being a member of the public. And we have to ask ourselves at the moment, do the police really have the public's consent in what we're doing? We're currently raising a generation of people to be empowered, stand up for what they believe in, challenge inappropriate behaviours, yet we're expecting them to just simply trust us in doing our job, approve of our actions, where they actually have little to no understanding of how the police actually police, the powers that govern us, and particularly considering most of what they see is actually quite negative. Back when the Peeling principles were first established, people just expected the police to be doing the right thing, but now society questions it, and rightfully so. I feel like this was quite apt during the disappearance and subsequent murder of Sarah Everard by serving police officer Wayne Couzens, and particularly regarding her vigil. Just like every other police officer, I was completely and utterly outraged at his actions. My heart absolutely poured out for Sarah and her family. The subsequent fallout felt like it was sort of a fight between the police and young female members of society. This sort of meant I felt quite a bit of an internalised battle, obviously being a young female in my mid-20s, but also being a police officer. Many of my friends were sort of sharing articles, facts, figures on female safety and violence, particularly male violence on women, and they completely resonated with me. I've called family members when I've been walking late at night because I haven't felt safe. I've been sexually assaulted on the underground. I've been catcalled on the street and continually made to feel unsafe. But then a lot of the talk transferred onto police, and when Sarah's vigil was held, even more so in regard to the police response to it. I felt like I was being torn between being a young woman who's experienced much of what was being discussed to being a police officer and immediately feeling like I had to defend myself, for someone else's actions. It just didn't feel like I could be both. Albeit, whilst the conversations were completely needed, I found much of what was being shared on social media quite ironic, really. There was a lot of conversation on preventing people, in this case younger men or men, from offending through proper education from a younger age, preventing them, from committing that crime in the first place, rather than punishing them once they've done it. But then a lot of these people, again, a lot of my friends, were sharing opinions on specific incidents with the police, which maybe they've only seen, a 30-second clip of, not fully knowing the incident and having no education of, like I said earlier, how the police police. So the question here is, can anything be done to strengthen trust and build confidence in a younger and more technologically dominant society so we can actually continue to police by consent? And for me, the two standout aspects here are education and, as mentioned right at the beginning, influence. I've mentioned earlier, how do we expect this new generation of empowered and vocal society to trust what we're doing without any knowledge of modern day policing? And I believe quite a lot, obviously not all, of the negativity that I've seen against the police might not even be there or might not even be reported if people actually understood what we did. There are obviously some situations that are completely not in regards to that and that are totally valid for people to be outraged by. But I feel that if people understood some of our powers, of the intentions, and also the history behind it, and maybe particular case law and things that have caused us to act the way that we do, even simple conversations I've had with some of my friends who've watched, like I said, a small clip online and have asked me, why would the police do something like that? Why would they do that? I've talked them through it. I've said what I might think, what I might be thinking and feeling, and how that a lot of what we do is working on prevention and suspicion. So, if I suspected or I believe that someone had a knife on them, I wouldn't wait for them to stab me with that knife or get that knife out. I'd be handcuffing them, searching them, using reasonable force if they're not complying, even though to other members of the public at that particular point, it may not look like they've actually done anything wrong. But education needs to go so much further than just through friends and family. I'm sure most of us have had the feeling in our adulthood. I can still remember how to do Pythagoras' theorem that I've learned at school. I've never used it, but I was never taught about finances, taxes, that kind of things I need to know. Well, why aren't we introducing policing and the law and as part of classes in school, going out to universities, doing open lectures? Or maybe if we can't actually do this ourselves because of resourcing, why aren't we advocating for a change in curriculum or providing resources and lesson plans for schools to adopt these themselves with our support? The other thing we've got to talk about, I've said, is influence. Nowadays, the younger generation are more in touch with the online world than the real world. And I saw a quote yesterday, which was coincidentally on my Instagram, that read, 15 years ago, the internet was escape from the real world. Now, the real world is an escape from the internet. And yes, police forces are doing more and more through social media to engage with people, but how many people actually do engage with it? And are they the people that we want to be and need to be engaging with? The vast majority of modern engagement is through individual social media influencers, the likes of Stacey Solomon, Dr. Alex George, Mrs. Hinch, Jamila Jamil, Joe Wicks, the list is endless. But after, for example, after Mrs. Hinch shared a love of a certain cleaning cloth, it led to a 10,000% rise in sales. She posted one Instagram story of a company, and that company's followers on Instagram went from just 49 to 36.2 thousand people. Dr. Alex George was appointed as a youth mental health ambassador by the Prime Minister because of his widespread impact on opening discussion on young people's mental health after building up his social media influence through his appearance on Love Island. I was quite disappointed, when I read that back in 2020, there was a police officer that also went on that show, but he was forced to quit the job because of his appearance. That made me feel like we're distancing ourselves from the public. That could have been a great opportunity for us to show that the public are the police are the public, and we're missing this potential opportunity to influence the public. We're showing, that individual officers, we're not just the police, we are individuals as well. And we also, I think, in those situations could be providing them sort of the right education as such, as I've said earlier. People like and they relate to Stacey Solomon and Mrs. Hinch because they're similar to them. They're one of us. They're the public. People like Dr. Alex George because he has the knowledge and experience in his field and is opening up conversations through his down-to-earth personality. We could be doing the same through the right police officers, but we're not providing the capability or the support to do so. We need to take a step back and realise that the world and the people that make up it is completely different to what it was 193 years ago. But do we need to accept that we're failing these core principles that should still ring true, or that they no longer stand today and policing by consent might, or some say should, disappear altogether? I believe that these fundamental principles should still stand, obviously, but the way that we interpret and promote them needs to be adapted to suit our ever-changing society. And far more needs to be done to educate and influence relationships between the public and the police. We are, after all members of the same society. We need to work together to promote understanding, tolerance and harmony in a way that can suit us all.
Olivia, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think you really have brought out some of the tensions that we're facing. I think the quote for me today is, "It just didn't feel like I could be both. How can I be public and police at the same time?" And it really is that challenging kind of Jekyll and Hyde almost type approach of how we are and how we're seen. And I think that's an incredibly powerful line of how can I be both. It's very easy to quote it. It's very easy to kind of point at it and see it like that. But it's just extraordinary. So Olivia, thank you for that. Really, really good input. And it takes us on to Taslim from QED. And Taslim, it's a great treat to have you with us this afternoon, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to read this speech on behalf of Adiba Malik, Deputy Chief Executive, as she's unable to be here today. For those of us who work to support Bradford's ethnic minority communities, 2001 still casts a long shadow. Race riots destroyed businesses, shops, and property. More than 1,000 young people ran through city centre areas with large Asian populations and mainly white working class suburbs. Hundreds of police officers were hurt. The number of convictions for riot was unprecedented in legal history, and the scars remain to this day. 20 years later, many of Bradford's ethnic minority communities are still suspicious of the police. This pattern is repeated wherever QED Foundation works, and particularly across post-industrial Yorkshire and Lancashire, in the East Midlands and London. The Black Lives Matter protests of 2021 and the divisive impact of the coronavirus pandemic have heightened distrust of all forms of authority. And once again, emotions are running high. But it doesn't have to be this way. QED Foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary just months before the Bradford riots. We were founded in Manningham, the neighbourhood at the heart of the disturbances, with the vision of creating a society where everyone, regardless of his or her race or religion, would be treated fairly and enjoy the same opportunities. And although we were soon working across the UK, to this day, we have stayed in Bradford as a small charity by choice. This makes it much easier to win the trust of the communities we seek to help. People feel that they're able to open up to us about their lived experiences, and we use these insights to develop innovative and practical interventions that help them engage with wider society. We may be a small charity, but we still think big. We support politicians, civil servants, local government officials, businesses, and large public sector organisations to provide services that meet the needs of all the communities. We know that one charity, no matter how large, can only do so much. But by showing what is possible and encouraging others to adapt their working practices accordingly, we can improve the quality of life of people from ethnic minority backgrounds across the UK. Now, many of the large public sector organisations that we work with face similar challenges to the police, starting with winning the trust and confidence of the communities that they serve at grassroots level. That means avoiding preconceptions and listening carefully to how people's lived experiences are shaped, not just by their ethnicity, but also by how this interacts with their age, gender, social class, faith, geographical location, and health status. QED Foundation helps such organisations to gain greater understanding by designing bespoke cultural awareness training sessions with a specific focus on British Muslim communities. We also go a step further by enabling them to establish long-term relationships with those communities that they serve. For instance, we have arranged roundtable discussions for public sector bodies with local influencers, not those in formal leadership positions, but people whose opinions are trusted and respected by their peers. These men and women are invaluable sounding boards for anyone wanting to explore new ideas of ways of working. We also arrange Seeing is Believing visits, which give public sector staff the opportunity to see grassroots community work in action. Ethnic minority groups are extremely diverse, both economically and socially, and effective neighbourhood policing must meet their individual needs. Now, this is not going to happen unless each force can recruit, retain, and develop a workforce that matches local demographic profiles at all levels of seniority. We know it isn't easy, but there were still no BAME chief constables and only one police and crime commissioner in the UK in 2021. Now that sends out a powerful message about how seriously the needs of ethnic minority communities are taken, or indeed understood, by those who are determining policies and priorities. However, it's equally important that people feel able to relate to those officers with whom they come into direct contact. QED Foundation has helped 2,000 directors and senior managers of large private and public sector organisations to recruit, retain, and reward ethnic minority employees. We also arrange confidential focus groups with existing staff where there are concerns about people from certain backgrounds leaving in disproportionate numbers. Finally, our own community work, for example, by encouraging young people to explore career paths they might not otherwise have considered, can help services like the police to attract a more diverse workforce. This year will be challenging. Increased awareness of the ramifications of social inequality have put public services under close scrutiny, and some commentators have voiced concerns that even after 20 years after the riots tore apart our northern cities, there may be another tipping point soon. But I believe 2022 will be a time of opportunity. The coronavirus pandemic has taught us that when we put our mind to it, we can do things differently, even when budgets are stretched to the limit. It's now time to rise to the challenge of ensuring our police forces do everything in their power to meet the needs of all the communities that they serve. Thank you.
Taslim, thank you very much. Again, I mean some really pithy stuff of 20 years ago, this is what was going on. QED existed 10 years before that. And so absolutely there are the foundation blocks that are there. I think that I loved your line around you've got to avoid preconception and start listening carefully. But I was always kind of conscious of the early diversity training we introduced in policing in the wake of the awful Stephen Lawrence murder. And actually it did nothing to challenge the behaviour of racists. And that probably came out in the Secret Policeman documentary that was in the early 2000s. And so there's something more fundamental, something more challenging and gripping that we need to be able to do if we really need to tip it. And that's why I am taken by your line later on of is maybe there's another tipping point coming too that is absolutely key within this. And finally, from our speakers, it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome Lord Herbert to be able to address us as the chair of the college. And I kind of mentioned at the beginning that there's kind of this session is around the point of inflection, the point of tension and stress, but equally the point of influence. And hugely, the college, I think, does have a really significant influence and credibility and a voice that could use this turning point, this inflection point, in order to be able to emphasise that. But Nick, great to have you here this afternoon, and the floor's yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Giles, and I agree with that, and I agree about the importance of the college. It's a great pleasure to join another Cityforum event. Thank you so much, Mark, for your kind introduction, and I really am pleased to be back after, I think, a decade. It was 10 years ago when I was briefly police minister, and there was a period that was challenging for the government and for policing because it involved having to restrain public spending, but it was also a period of the driving of significant reforms. And one of the reforms that I was particularly committed to, which wasn't actually a manifesto commitment at the time, was the formation of the College of Policing. And I felt very strongly that it was needed so that we could focus on upholding the highest standards and consistent standards across the 43 forces, so that we could drive professionalism in the service, and crucially, so that we could foster leadership. Because it seemed to me that leadership, by which I mean leadership at all ranks, was absolutely critical to the ability of the service to meet challenges that were rising even 10 years ago. Of course, they've hardly diminished now. And it's interesting coming back to policing to see how some of the problems and issues are the same, but there are also some that have become amplified, and particularly in relation to some of the confidence issues that we've been discussing. And I think with the challenge that technology gives, both in terms of the service itself and the opportunities for crime. There's been a sort of great acceleration, and I think that it's not surprising really that the service is at times struggling to keep pace with the rapidity of these changes. Having sort of initiated the work that led to the setting up of the College of Policing with very sort of high hopes, when I was approached a year ago to ask whether I might be interested in applying to be chair of the board of the college, which is reserved, by the way, for a civilian. It's not a police appointment. It's very clear that the chief executive of the college is a policing professional, but that the board should be chaired by a civilian. And the role of the board is not to run the college. It is, as with any board, to hold the executive to account and to set the strategic direction, to challenge and support the executive. But I had to think twice about it because, firstly, it did mark a return to the world of policing, which I essentially left 10 years ago. But secondly, because I didn't feel that the college was quite doing what it is that we wanted it to. It wasn't quite doing what we said on the tin. And I consulted quite widely before I applied to become chair. And I discovered that the role of key stakeholders in policing, the view of those key stakeholders rather, was the same as mine. That the college was valued, that it was felt to be an important body with potentially a very powerful role, but wasn't quite fulfilling the expectations that had been set for it. In fact, I would go so far as to say it had slightly lost its way, and that was despite, of course, the good work that it was doing in lots of respects and the great efforts that were being made by its staff. And I think it was summarised really in the conversation I had with the policing minister, who said that he didn't feel that the college was sufficiently useful. He sort of used the language of utility to policing. And that is a view that has very much been reflected back to us in the college. After I took over as chair in January last year and immediately instituted a fundamental review of the college. And I said, look, we have got to, as any organization sometimes does, but particularly I think after 10 years, take a step back and look at sort of why we set up the college, what we want the college to do, and how we potentially could do things better and differently. And as part of that review, which I ran myself with the aid of my policy advisor, we didn't use external consultants for this. I instituted a comprehensive round of interviews with our stakeholders, so people in the service itself at all ranks, staff and police officers, and of course others who we interact with, including ministers and so on. And we also did a very comprehensive bit of survey work, so we really gained an understanding of what police officers actually thought and staff thought about the college. And frankly, it was sobering. And I think it was a necessary exercise because it was important to bring back to the college itself what it is that our customers, if you could call them that, were saying about us. And I think it changed the view in the college, which initially had been that we didn't really need to alter anything fundamentally, to an understanding that actually we did have to do things differently if we were to secure our place in the policing landscape. And the reflections, I think, will be sort of familiar to policing professionals on this call, but they were that the college is often too slow, has a lack of dynamism, quite a contrast actually to the service itself, which often is very dynamic and can do in its attitude, that the role of the college is poorly understood, by the same token, actually, the college doesn't always fully understand the needs of the front line. The college sometimes lacks credibility, as I'd mentioned, seen as insufficiently useful to policing, particularly, I think, to the vast majority of frontline officers. You know, there was a point of interaction with the college, you know, in recruitment, then at the in the acquisition of specialist skills or on promotion. But for the vast majority of officers, I think the question arises, well, you know, who are the college and why are they relevant to us? A particular gap, which I was reflecting on, listening to Sophie's very interesting contribution in how the college could do more to support police and crime commissioners, which are now an established part of the policing landscape. And so quite a big set of issues that I think were specific to the college itself about how it could be improved. And I was actually delighted that in the late summer last year, we appointed Andy Marsh to become chief executive of the college, you know, really experienced, respected police leader who has already made a huge difference at the college and who similarly understood both the value of the college, but also the ways in which it needed to change. And it will be Andy's job to take on the reforms that I'm about to outline. But I think it's worth just mentioning that there were also issues that arose as a consequence of our fundamental review that are wider, that aren't just about the college, that actually are about policing as a whole. And I think they're relevant to the discussion that we're having now. Some of those, I think, are a reflection of the 43 force model and the weaknesses which we all know, for better or for worse, that model bequeaths. And that is, for instance, you know, a question about what, you know, where is the strategic center of policing? Where is the strategic brain? Where does that lie? It's actually not clear, is it? You know, it doesn't really lie, can't lie in one force, the Met, however big it is. It doesn't lie in the MPCC. It doesn't lie in the Inspectorate. It can't lie in the Home Office that has no police officers working for it. So it's not really clear kind of, you know, where that strategic centre for policing sits. And that absence of sort of strategic forethought and collective planning, I think, you know, does point to some of the challenges that policing faces in being able to respond to changing developments. And similarly, the uptake of good practice is too slow in policing. You know, the diversified model, the disaggregated model is in one respect very helpful when it comes to innovation. You know, forces doing really interesting things at the local level and so on. But sometimes the ability to disseminate that good practice is very slow. And there needs to be, there is a sort of, you know, a role for the centre again, even in that 43 force model of ensuring a quicker uptake. We know there's an issue of lack of consistency in standards. It's something that the Inspectorate is constantly commenting on. So those are, if you like, some of the sort of some of the structural issues. But I think there are also cultural issues that go to the heart of things we need to address in policing that aren't just about the 43 force model, you know, because they exist in relation to our big, you know, our one big, you know, effectively regional force that is sometimes held as the model for what other forces should be. They apply to the Met equally as they do to smaller forces. So I don't think you can just say that these issues are because we have a disaggregated model of policing, and that is that I don't think that we have a proper culture of CPD in policing. We don't have a kind of beginning of your career to end of your career culture of the development of police officers or staff. We develop officers kind of on the job, but also, you know, in terms of the formal training we give, it's periodic. And in particular, there's a lack of leadership training for the first line leaders, you know, for sergeants and inspectors. There's quite a contrast here with the armed forces. Now, they are a completely different model. You know, the armed forces, you know, deploy for what, a third of the year, they rest for a third, and they have then the time to train for the other third. And so they're resourced in a way that it enables that. Policing is incredibly busy, incredibly challenged, 24/7 operationally busy. But I think one of the consequences of that is that, if you like, the training and the priority that's given to training, to professional development and so on, is very often considered to be kind of second order. You know, it's the sort of eyes rolling, oh God, do we have to do that? Because frankly, I'm a very, very busy person, and I don't have time either to do that for myself or for my team and so on. And that's actually reflected also in the quantum of resource that is developed to allocated to training and professional development, which is actually very low in policing and probably is falling per head as a result of the uplift, which of course is otherwise a very good thing and a huge opportunity, and so on. So I think there's a bigger challenge that actually confronts policing. It isn't just one that can be solved by the college, which with our budget of a few tens of millions is a drop in the ocean, frankly, compared to what is being spent on policing as a whole in terms of the billions that policing is spending every year, which is, how much are we actually devoting to investing in the training and professional development of police officers on a continual basis? And the answer is not enough, and the college has to have, I think, a big role in driving that. And then I think the last thing I'd like to just say, by way of this kind of sort of provocation, is this: over the course of the last few years, there have been, a series of these very high-profile and difficult events that have been referred to, and Olivia referred, for instance, to the tremendous difficulty that it presents for serving police officers individually, as well as for the service as a whole, of things like the terrible Sarah Everard case. But we've seen others subsequently, haven't we, with the Stephen Port case and so on, where there have frankly been failings in police that have given rise to public confidence, and that's on top of the whole issue around Black Lives Matter and the confidence of diverse communities in policing. That trust and confidence issue, which we've been discussing, is completely central to policing. But where problems have arisen, the response has generally been in policing, and I'm talking about in the sort of wider context, that there are kind of inquiries, there are inspectorate reports, and then there is a sort of kind of catalogue of very prescriptive things that policing is then required to do. And the approach that is generally taken is of, if you like, more direction, more prescription. We will get better as a service by ensuring that every single officer and every single force does the following things, and we're going to lift the standards in that way. And I think that is an approach which, of course, there are changes that are merited and necessary. But overall, I think if you take a step back, I don't think that we can expect that the service will be able to respond to modern challenges with the sort of flexibility that's necessary if we always think that the solution to every problem is that level of prescription. Actually, what we need to ensure is that we have a very highly trained, developed, professional cadre of police officers and staff who are equipped with the right skills and the right values to be able to exercise the right judgments in the course of their work. And so I think an approach that sees more and more money spent on compliance and inspection, and less money spent on professional development and ensuring that people are doing the right things in the first place, is actually the wrong balance. And I think it's a balance that we need to redress. So we in the college, in conclusion, are going to focus on three key areas in the way in which we operate going forward. We're going to focus on boosting professionalism to ensure that police officers and staff have access to the best in CPD and that it's properly prioritised. We're going to focus on improving leadership at all levels, not just at the senior levels, but at all levels, which I think is related. And we're going to focus on the college's role in driving consistency, which is so important for the service as a whole and for public confidence. And it is through the prism of those three things that the college will continue to do what we are required to do, which is to oversee training, to oversee standards, and to oversee the evidence base. But we're going to do it with that focus on professionalism, leadership and consistency. That I think is what the service is asking us to do, and I think is what the public requires of the service as well.
Nick, thank you very much for that, and really clear kind of messages there around the history the college has faced, where it is today, and how it sees a way into what's going forward.